All right. Yeah. Ananya's she's going to be out of town for a little bit.
Mm.
Okay. So first things first, today we're going to do the women's suffrage movement. The
Okay.
women's suffrage movement. The first thing I want to do is the word suffrage. I want to make sure you understand this word correctly. Suffrage has nothing to do with suffering, right? The words look the same, but it's not the same. Okay. Suffrage just means voting. So like Frederick Douglass was a Negro suffrage activist, right? So he was trying to get black people to vote. And this is a women's suffrage group, okay? Usually when we talk about the suffrage movement in the United States, we're usually talking about women's suffrage. It's when the word gets used the most common, but it can be used for anybody, right? Native American suffrage, black suffrage, whatever.
Right.
Okay. All right. So okay, so first off, there's a document that I put the link to, Emmeline Pankhurst's speech. She gives a speech there. I want you to read the document. The quiz that you're going to take on Wednesday is based on that document.
Okay.
Okay. All right. I know you haven't read it yet because I just posted it just a couple minutes ago. So, okay. So the women's suffrage movement, in your notes, break it off into two. Put the old movement and the new movement. The old movement and the new movement. Okay. So on the left side, the old movement, this is a movement that's been around since 1840s. Since the 1840s, it started with Seneca Falls in the 1840s. And the leaders of those movements, do you remember the names of those women?
No.
Okay, Susan B. Anthony, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Those were the two biggest names. There are more women, but those are the two big ones. And they had been leading the movement for like 60 years, right? Susan B. Anthony led the movement for something like 64 years, something like that. So she'd been leading the movement for a long, long time. By the time we get to the 1917, she's dead. Okay, they're Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They're both dead, right? The leader of the movement now is a woman named Carrie Chapman Catt.
Okay.
And the thing you need to remember is with a lot of these women leaders, they all have three names. You need all three. Okay, you need all three. So Carrie Chapman Catt, she's the leader of the movement. Now, this old style movement had been making some progress. Okay, they focused on going state by state. They focused on going state by state. The movement focused on creating a local activist organization in each state, and then push for legislative change. So they spent a lot of their time writing laws and writing bills and then giving them to politicians and trying to get those politicians to pass those bills. Okay. What states are the first states where women vote?
Utah and was it Wyoming?
Yep. Wyoming and Utah, numbers 1 and 2. Wyoming and Utah. But after Wyoming and Utah, Idaho, Colorado, Montana follow, right? All the Western states do it, and then it starts moving further back east. Okay. At this point in time, by 1917, we're looking at about 20 states have women voting. About 20 states. And the movement is spreading, but once it's heading back east, it's much slower. Okay. You're dealing with much bigger populations of people. You're dealing with, more entrenched traditional power bases, like bigger church groups and stuff. You're dealing with a lot of that kind of stuff that's in the East Coast. The advantage of this movement, what's the advantage of this kind of strategy of getting this done? What's the advantage? What do you think?
There will always be like a movement in the West, I guess.
Okay. All right. So the advantage is it's durable, right? Like it's really hard to change that once you've like amended the constitutions of all these different states and stuff, right? So it's durable. That's true. This isn't just like a president changes it and then the next president changes it again, right? This is a durable change. So that's one, right? And it's also successful. It is working, right? What's the
Yeah.
disadvantage?
It's gonna take a long time.
Slow, right? It takes forever. They've been working on this for 60 years and they're only at like half the country, right? It takes forever. Now, Carrie Chapman Catt's she's a lawyer. She's a lawyer. She's super smart. She's running all these organizations, and she has organizations basically in all the states she's running, and she's like kind of organizing all these like local leaders and stuff like that, right? But the women's rights movement is just chomping at the bit, right? We've gotten into this progressive era. We have a lot of change happening. We're like fighting big companies. We're getting workers' rights. We're getting a lot of these things are starting to change, and the women are starting to get agitated. Okay, that's in your old column. In your new column over here, we're going to enter in with this woman right here, Emmeline Pankhurst. Emmeline Pankhurst. Okay, so Pankhurst is a Brit, right? She's English. But this is one of the rare cases where I'm going to give you a non-American, one of the rare cases. But I think you need her in order to understand this movement. Okay. Pankhurst delivers a speech in Hartford, Connecticut. And that's the speech that I've asked you to read. And in that speech, she makes a metaphor about two babies. And she says, one baby is quiet and the mother can ignore the baby. One baby is loud and the mother can't ignore it, right? The women's rights movement needs to be the loud baby, right? She's using a motherhood metaphor, right? She's talking to an audience of women. Now, here's the deal with Pankhurst. She was a terrorist. She would like blow up buildings in the name of women's rights and stuff, right? And some of this gets pretty extreme, where she would get arrested, purposely orchestrate things where she gets arrested by the police, right? She would call the police on herself to get arrested, but she would call the media first. And so the newspapers show up, they take pictures, write reports on this, right? And they take pictures of the police harassing her as she gets arrested. Um, she's actually an enemy in England at this point. She smuggled herself out of the country because she's wanted for crimes in England. So she's in New Haven, Connecticut, giving this speech, and she inspires this new generation of women, right? This new generation of women are going to become the second baby, if you will, right? Alice Paul and Lucy Burns are our two leaders of this new movement. These are very young women. Okay, Carrie Chapman Catt, she's in her 50s already, right? So Alice Paul and Lucy Burns are in their 20s. They're in their early 20s, and they don't want to go 50 years without getting change, right? They want change now. So Paul and Burns they decide to be that second baby, if you will, right? And so they decide to start up protests. And so they start up a group called the Silent Sentinels. Now, the Silent Sentinels are organization of protesters. They start to organize big protests like in the streets, blocking off the entire street, right? They're starting to get thousands of people blocking off the streets and stuff. One of their most famous protests is outside of the White House this entire time. And they just are outside of this White House 24 hours a day, all day long. Woodrow Wilson, who's the president at this point in 1917, Woodrow Wilson is a very conservative man, very, very conservative president. He does not support the women's rights movement, the women's suffrage movement. He does not support any of those things, right? He is a supporter of the KKK. He's a supporter of a lot of this other stuff. He's a very conservative guy. And he hates these women in front of his house. He hates them protesting, right? He complains about it all the time. World War I breaks out. This is your next line now. When World War I breaks out and the United States enters World War I eventually in 1917, they pass the Sedition Act again. They repassed the Sedition Act. Now, do you remember the Alien and Sedition Act from back in the day with John Adams?
Yeah.
What did the Sedition Act do?
Basically said that if you criticize John Adams in any way, you get arrested or something like that.
So that's how he used it. But what did the act actually say?
Oh, shoot.
He abused the act. The way you remembered it right there is the way he abused the act.
Don't think I remember that.
Okay, so Sedition Act is speaking out against the government, right? Speaking out against the government or trying to overthrow the government or undermine the government. Okay, that's the Sedition Act. John Adams, you're correct. John Adams basically used it against people who were mean to him, right? So after John Adams abused it, they got rid of the act. They brought it back for World War I. So Woodrow Wilson is going to use this act to arrest labor leaders, black rights leaders, communists, and women. Wilson orders the women outside of the White House to be arrested. Now, during a war, it's tradition that all protests stop during the war because everyone can like support the troops and support the government and stuff, right? But these women continue to protest because the women are saying, look, we're not against the United States. We want to be part of the United States. We want to be part of the government, right? And we just want rights. We want the same thing that all of our troops everywhere are fighting for, right? And they say, we will happily support the troops and support the war if you give us a vote to support them with, right? But Wilson arrests them. They're sent to the Occoquan workhouse. Let me spell it for you. Occoquan. Occoquan. Occoquan workhouse. Okay, now it's a work, they say workhouse, but it's a prison. It had been converted into a prison. They arrest all these women, including Alice Paul and Lucy Burns. Okay, and 12 other women. And while they're in the prison, these women are abused badly. They're beaten, they're slapped around, they're starved, and then when they're given food, the food is they're given food, and the food is like rotten food with maggots in it and stuff, right? One of the women dies. She sees a guard. A guard slaps one of the women so hard that she falls down and hits her head on the wall. And the other woman witnessing it is so scared that she has a heart attack and dies. Yeah. Okay. While they're in the prison, a sympathetic guard is getting the word out of what's going on. The women's groups on the outside are talking about this and raising all hell and getting this out in the newspapers and stuff. And they start getting reports from inside the prison, reports about what's happening in these prisons. Alice Paul, Lucy Burns, and the other women go on a hunger strike. Woodrow Wilson orders the guards, keep these women alive. We can't let them die. So they force feed the girls. They force feed the women. And they force feed them by shoving a tube up their nose, down their throat. And so you have a tube going up your nose, down your throat, all the way into your stomach. And then they pour chicken broth down the tube. Now, that's extremely painful, right? It's extremely painful. It also can be dangerous. There are people who, none of the women in this case, but there are people who, when they do this, they die, right? Because putting the tube up, the tissue is very, very soft and it's very, very soft. It causes like internal bleeding and stuff, right? So it causes all sorts of lacerations on the inside of the tissue there. And so it's quite dangerous, quite dangerous. Anyway, these women, this picture gets published in newspapers around the country of, they say that it's Lucy Burns getting force fed. The picture is not. The picture is actually, it's an artist rendition of it, right? And they have pictures from like England of this happening. They don't have actual pictures of this, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because it blows up, right? The women are put on trial, and when the women are put on trial, they appear broken and busted, right? The women appear starved and beaten, and they appear dirty and beat down and stuff, right? And the lawyer makes an argument that these women aren't committing sedition. They're not arguing against the government. They're actually arguing in favor of the government. They want to be part of the government, right? That it's anti-sedition, in fact. Wilson eventually lets them go, right? But it's too late. It's too late for Wilson to oppose this because newspapers across the entire country are upset. Women are protesting all over the country. Women are super, super upset that just for asking for their vote, these women got like arrested and tortured, basically, right? The movement has a lot of power now. It's going to start really pushing forward. This is the point where Carrie Chapman Catt steps back in again and she says, "Hey, women of New York, are you really upset about this? We have an amendment for you," right? And she has all these laws already made and already written up. And she's like, "We've already analyzed the New York Constitution. We know what we need to do. Here you go," right? And so this is where you're going to get a merging of these two, the new and the old, right? The new ends up creating the emotional reaction where the old gets like a lot of the legwork done, like a lot of the actual legal work done. The result is that they don't get it passed during the war, but after the war in 1920, they passed the 19th Amendment. Women get the right to vote in the 19th Amendment. Okay? All right, so I think that's a good place to stop. Read the Emmeline Pankhurst speech. You're going to have the quiz on Pankhurst's speech, and it's going to be relating what she says in the speech to the movement itself.
Okay.
Cool. And that'll be your quiz for Wednesday. Do you have any problems or questions or anything?
I think I'm good.
Okay. All right.